Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Concept of the Political by Carl Schmitt. The version I have is the expanded edition. It also has another essay that he wrote a little bit earlier, actually, than he wrote this one. And that one is called The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations. I'm not going to be looking at that essay at all. It also has some notes from from Leo Strauss. It has an introduction by George Schwab, who is the translator. It has a foreword by Tracy Strong. But all I'm going to look at is the actual text, The Concept of the Political. The Concept of the Political was published in 1932 in German. Carl Schmitt is a German. He at one point was a member of the Nazi Party. He was actually detained for something like a year and a half or something, quite some period of time after the end of World War II, but then released and found that he hadn't actually participated in anything to a point where they felt it was necessary to pursue him. He's got a sort of an anti-liberal approach to politics that I want to talk about. I think he makes a very pointed critique of liberalism, and it's probably something that is definitely worth considering. I'll probably be using his points here and there in some upcoming books. I like to try to gain some nuggets out of these books I read that I can then use to help me analyze further books. And so what I'm going to be looking at here is his definition of politics and his criticism of liberalism. Like all of my episodes, I've got a few sections I want to read and then comment on. None of the sections I'm going to read here are particularly long. I've got, I believe, 6 sections to read. And I'll just go ahead and jump into the first one, where he defines politics and the political. And this is section 2 of the book. It's not a long book. It's interspersed with sections where he adds his own additional notes to the text. Section 2 doesn't have any of those notes added, but it's only like 2 pages long. And there's, I believe, 8 sections here. They're not all only 2 pages long. But it's, suffice to say, it's a short book. It's like just over 100 pages long, I believe. Anyway, so this is the entirety that I'm going to read of section 2, where he really lays out the definition of politics. So in this section, he says, quote, "A definition of the political can be obtained only by discovering and defining the specifically political categories. In contrast to the various relatively independent endeavors of human thought and action, particularly the moral, aesthetic, and economic, the political has its own criteria which express themselves in a characteristic way. The political must therefore rest on its own ultimate distinctions, to which all action with a specifically political meaning can be traced. Let us assume that in the realm of morality, the final distinctions are between good and evil. In aesthetics, beautiful and ugly. In economics, profitable and unprofitable. The question then is whether there is also a special distinction which can serve as a simple criterion of the political and of what it consists. The nature of such a political distinction is surely different from that of the others. It is independent of them, and as such, can speak clearly for itself. The specific political distinction, to which political actions and motives can be reduced, is that between friend and enemy. This provides a definition in the sense of a criterion, and not as an exhaustive definition or one indicative of a substantial content. Insofar as it is not derived from other criteria, the antithesis of friend and enemy correspond to the relatively independent criteria of other antitheses. good and evil in the moral sphere, beautiful and ugly in the aesthetic sphere, and so on. In any event, it is independent. Not in the sense of a distinct new domain, but in that it can neither be based on any one antithesis or any combination of other antitheses, nor can it be traced to these. If the antithesis of good and evil is not simply identical with that of beautiful and ugly, profitable and unprofitable, and cannot be directly reduced to the others, then the antithesis of friend and enemy must even less be confused with or mistaken for the others. The distinction of friend and enemy denotes the utmost degree of intensity of a union or separation, of an association or dissociation. It can exist theoretically and practically without having simultaneously to draw upon all these moral, aesthetic, economic, or other distinctions. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He need not appear as an economic competitor, and it may even be advantageous to engage with him in business transactions, but he is, nevertheless, the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, in a specially intense way, existentially something different, an alien, so that in the extreme case conflicts with him are possible. These can neither be decided by a previously determined general norm, nor by the judgment of a disinterested and therefore neutral third party. Only the actual participants can correctly recognize, understand, and judge the concrete situation and settle the extreme case of conflict. Each participant is in a position to judge whether the adversary intends to negate his opponent's way of life and therefore must be repulsed or fought in order to preserve one's own form of existence. Emotionally, the enemy is easily treated as being evil and ugly because every distinction, most of all the political, as the strongest and most intense of the distinctions and categorizations, draws upon other distinctions for support. This does not alter the autonomy of such distinctions. Consequently, the reverse is also true. The morally evil, aesthetically ugly, or economically damaging need not necessarily be the enemy. The morally good, aesthetically beautiful, and economically profitable need not necessarily become the friend, in the specifically political sense of the word. Thereby, the inherently objective nature and autonomy of the political becomes evident by virtue of its being able to treat, distinguish, and comprehend the friend-enemy antithesis independently of other antitheses. End quote. Okay, so there you have it. Essentially, he is saying that what defines politics, what defines the realm of the political, is that it concerns all areas which are primarily concerned with the distinction between friend and enemy. And I'll get into more detail in some of the later sections when, what it is that, how one treats an enemy and how one, where the authority lies to determine an enemy and how other areas can potentially become political when they're not. What is it possible for the realm of the economic to become political, the realm of the moral to become political? Because he says there's distinctions, there's these different realms of human value systems, I guess, where, like in the realm of the economic, activities are determined to be profitable or not profitable. Aesthetics is a judgment call between what's beautiful and what's ugly, morality, good and evil, and so on and so forth, and that these other spheres can be drawn upon to reinforce the friend-enemy distinction as needed. But ultimately, they are their own spheres, and it's not necessarily the case that what is morally good is always and everywhere determined to be the friend, and what is evil, morally evil, is always and everywhere determined to be the enemy, insofar as the friend and enemy distinction is a political distinction. So there you have the essential definition. Now, he talks a little bit about liberalism in this next section, and what essentially amounts to the failure of liberalism to recognize this friend-enemy distinction. Here he says, quote, "The friend and enemy concepts are to be understood in their concrete and existential sense, not as metaphors or symbols, not mixed and weakened by economic, moral, and other conceptions, least of all in a private individualistic sense, as a psychological expression of private emotions and tendencies. They are neither normative nor pure spiritual antitheses. Liberalism, in one of its typical dilemmas of intellect and economics, has attempted to transform the enemy from the viewpoint of economics into a competitor, and from the intellectual point into a debating adversary. In the domain of economics, there are no enemies, only competitors, and in a thoroughly moral and ethical world, perhaps only debating adversaries. It is irrelevant here whether one rejects, accepts, or perhaps finds it an atavistic remnant of barbaric times that nations continue to group themselves according to friend and enemy, or hopes that the antithesis will one day vanish from the world, or whether it is perhaps sound pedagogic reasoning to imagine that enemies no longer exist at all. The concern here is neither with abstractions nor with normative ideals, but with inherent reality and the real possibility of such a distinction. One may or may not share these hopes and pedagogic ideals, but rationally speaking, it cannot be denied that nations continue to group themselves according to the friend and enemy antithesis, that the distinction still remains actual today, and that this is an ever-present possibility for every people existing in the political sphere. The enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. The enemy is solely the public enemy, because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to a whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such a relationship. End quote. Okay, so he briefly mentions liberalism there. He doesn't get into a tremendous amount of detail, but he essentially says that the liberalism has attempted to transform the enemy into a competitor within the sphere of economics and a debating adversary in the sphere of the intellectual and moral realm, essentially implying that liberalism doesn't really recognize the political enemy. Now, this was written almost 100 years ago. The situation was actually exactly 90 years ago this was released. The situation today clearly is not exactly the same as it was then, but there is a sort of concept that we're going to somehow transcend the friend-enemy distinction, or that there's something barbaric about recognizing the friend-enemy distinction, especially when you're talking, he says it's not an individual friend and an individual enemy. It's not someone that you have a particular dislike for, you consider your personal rival or something. It's not a personal issue, it's a collective issue. So a group of people in opposition to a different group of people is the enemy. That's the enemy he's speaking of, the friend-enemy distinction. And this makes people uncomfortable. We don't like to think that, this other group of people, the other, is our enemy. By definition, these people are our enemies. We want to judge every single person individually. So, it's not, this particular group of people who is the enemy, but, it's their leaders who, as individuals, who are distinctly the enemies. Those are bad people in charge of this other group, whereas we don't really feel as comfortable saying that this group as such is the enemy. But political action is dependent on the idea that different groups find themselves in positions of being enemies. And insofar as the group is driven and is accepting the leadership of various people who we try to pinpoint as the enemy, so long as the whole group operates under the control of this person or that person and accepts their leadership, then the whole group must become the enemy, must take the role of the enemy. So with that said, he's basically saying that liberalism tries to channel everything through these other avenues and operates under the belief that even though we may not have eliminated the sphere of politics, I mean, when you're eliminating the friend-enemy distinction from all of aspects of life all over the world, you're eliminating the realm of the political. And that certainly is going to go along with the notion of, eliminating the national boundaries, eliminating the nation state as an entity which is poised to engage in, warfare with other nation states. These sort of conflicting entities, if we have a global world with, a multitude of corporations and say like one world government, and there's corporations and they're competing with one another, and there's different schools of thought or parties that are competing with one another in the intellectual debate, that's kind of like the liberal dream that we're going to get to. We're going to get to sort of transcend national boundaries, and all conflict is going to be taken out of the realm of war and rechanneled into economic disputes, economic competition, or some sort of like academic disputes, things of that nature. But he doesn't really believe that such a thing is possible, and I'll get into some of that in some sections, some further sections like this one here when he talks about war. So in this section, he says, quote, "War is neither the aim nor the purpose nor even the very content of politics, but as an ever-present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behavior. The criterion of the friend and enemy distinction in no way implies that one particular nation must forever be the friend or enemy of another specific nation, or that a state of neutrality is not possible or could not be politically reasonable. As with every political concept, the neutrality concept, too, is subject to the ultimate presupposition of a real possibility of a friend and enemy grouping. Should only neutrality prevail in the world, then not only war, but also neutrality would come to an end. The politics of avoiding war terminates, as does all politics, whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. What always matters is the possibility of the extreme case taking place, the real war, and the decision whether this situation has or has not arrived. That the extreme case appears to be an exception does not negate its decisive character, but confirms it all the more. To the extent that wars today have decreased in number and frequency, they have proportionally increased in ferocity. War is still today the most extreme possibility. One can say that the exceptional case has an especially decisive meaning which exposes the core of the matter, for only in real combat is revealed the most extreme consequence of the political grouping of friend and enemy. From this most extreme possibility, human life derives its specifically political tension. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, a completely pacified globe, would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. It is conceivable that such a world might contain many very interesting antitheses and contrasts, competitions and intrigues of every kind, but there would not be a meaningful antithesis whereby men would be required to sacrifice life, authorized to shed blood and kill other human beings. For the definition of the political, it is here even irrelevant whether such a world without politics is desirable as an ideal situation. The phenomenon of the political can be understood only in the context of the ever-present possibility of the friend and enemy grouping, regardless of the aspects which this possibility implies for morality, aesthetics, and economics. War, as the most extreme political means, discloses the possibility which underlies every political idea, namely the distinction of friend and enemy. This makes sense only as long as this distinction in mankind is actually present, or at least potentially possible. On the other hand, it would be senseless to wage war for purely religious, purely moral, purely juristic, or purely economic motives. The friend and enemy grouping, and therefore also war, cannot be derived from these specific antitheses of human endeavor. A war need be neither something religious, nor something morally good, nor something lucrative. War today is in all likelihood none of these. This obvious point is mostly confused by the fact that religious, moral, and other antitheses can intensify two political ones and can bring about the decisive friend or enemy constellation. If, in fact, this occurs, then the relevant antithesis is no longer purely religious, moral, or economic, but political. The sole remaining question, then, is always whether such a friend and enemy grouping is really at hand, regardless of which human motives are sufficiently strong to have brought it about. Nothing can escape this logical conclusion of the political. If pacifist hostility toward war were so strong as to drive pacifists into a war against non-pacifists, in a war against war, that would prove that pacifism truly possesses political energy, because it is sufficiently strong to group men according to friend and enemy. If, in fact, the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war, then it has become a political motive, i.e., it affirms, even if only as an extreme possibility, war, and even the reason for war. Presently, this appears to be a peculiar way of justifying wars. The war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. Such a war is necessarily unusually intense and inhuman because by transcending the limits of the political framework, it simultaneously degrades the enemy into moral and other categories and is forced to make of him a monster that must not only be defeated but also utterly destroyed. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his borders only. The feasibility of such war is particularly illustrative of the fact that war, as a real possibility, is still present today, and this fact is crucial for the friend and enemy antithesis and for the recognition of politics. Every religious, moral, economic, ethical, or other antithesis transforms into a political one if it is sufficiently strong to group human beings effectively according to friend and enemy. End quote. Okay, so there's a couple of good nuggets in that section. To start with, he basically says that while war is not the aim or purpose of politics, the existence of war, the possibility of war, of the most extreme case, as he calls it, necessitates the existence of politics. We separate ourselves into friend-enemy distinctions because we know that war is a possibility. He says that if there was such a world in which the possibility of war was totally eliminated, there would be no realm of the political, and there would be no friend-enemy distinction. But such a world is essentially impossible. So long as any entity exists which classifies itself as an enemy of any other entity anywhere, then the possibility for war exists. If even the possibility that one might potentially become an enemy, then the possibility for war exists. And so long as the possibility for war exists, people will separate themselves into friend and enemy distinctions. For instance, all of the people who are opposed to war against any people who are in favor of war, the pacifists against the non-pacifists. So long as the possibility exists somewhere that someone could be a non-pacifist, then the possibility for war exists and the friend and enemy distinction exists. The level of fundamental change in the human psyche that would be necessary for such a world without war seems like the sort of thing that could simply never happen. I mean, it would require that human beings lose all autonomous will, lose the capacity to be anything other than a pacifist. I mean, how otherwise could you do it? How could you really and truly create a world where everyone is a pacifist without forcing them to be pacifists? And that situation seems, number one, highly unlikely, and number two, really only possible after the result of a massive global war. I don't know. That seems really unlikely. And so it seems to me like we can assume that the realm of the political and the possibility of war have always existed and will always exist into the foreseeable future. And trying to build any sort of political system that's based on, first of all, any sort of folly that we're in a post-war world now, or that we are somehow within reach of a post-war world, seems foolish. To even aim in that direction, even if we think we can't reach it now, but at some point in the future we can reach it, still seems foolish. It seems like the smart approach is to accept that for all practical purposes, war will always be with us. The possibility for war will absolutely always be with us. Thus, friend-enemy distinctions will always be with us. And the realm of the political will always be with us. So let me move on from that section. When he's talking about the permanence, he's talking more about what I was just saying, the permanence of politics and the permanence of war in the world. So what he says in this section is, quote, "War cannot altogether be outlawed, but only specific individuals, peoples, states, classes, religions, etc., which, by being outlawed, are declared to be the enemy. The solemn declaration of outlawing war does not abolish the friend-enemy distinction, but on the contrary opens new possibilities by giving an international enemy declaration new content and new vigor. Were this distinction to vanish, then political life would vanish altogether. A people which exists in the political sphere cannot, despite entreating declarations to the contrary, escape from making this fateful distinction. If a part of the population declares that it no longer recognizes enemies, then, depending on the circumstance, it joins their side and aids them. Such a declaration does not abolish the reality of the friend and enemy distinction. Quite another question concerns citizens of a state who declare that they personally have no enemies. A private person has no political enemies. Such a declaration can at most say that he would like to place himself outside the political community to which he belongs, and continue to live as a private individual only. Furthermore, it would be a mistake to believe that a nation could eliminate the distinction of friend and enemy by declaring its friendship for the entire world, or by voluntarily disarming itself. The world will not thereby become depoliticized, and it will not be transplanted into a condition of pure morality, pure justice, or pure economics. If a people is afraid of the trials and risks implied by existing in the sphere of politics, then another people will appear which will assume these trials by protecting it against foreign enemies and thereby taking over political rule. The protector then decides who the enemy is by virtue of the eternal relation of protection and obedience." And then he goes on to say, quote, "It would be ludicrous to believe that a defenseless people has nothing but friends, and it would be a deranged calculation to suppose that the enemy could perhaps be touched by the absence of a resistance. No one thinks it possible that the world could, for example, be transformed into a condition of pure morality by the renunciation of every aesthetic or economic productivity. Even less can a people hope to bring about a purely moral or purely economic condition of humanity by evading every political decision. If a people no longer possesses the energy or the will to maintain itself in the sphere of politics, the latter will not thereby vanish from the world, only a weak people will disappear." End quote. That last section there is phenomenal, I think. The whole section there, it's really just saying you can't just declare yourself, a nation can't just declare itself to have transcended the realm of politics. There will always be other people out there who still abide by the friend-enemy distinction, who still abide by the world of politics, and unilateral disarmament or some sort of dedication to a pacifism or a delusional belief, let us say, in the friendliness and pacifistic qualities of the whole world, just sets a nation up to be destroyed or taken over by another stronger nation that's willing to employ war and conflict to get its way. He says in that last sentence, important sentence, if a people no longer possesses the energy or the will to maintain itself in the sphere of politics, the latter, by which he means the sphere of politics, will not thereby vanish from the world. Only a weak people will disappear. That's a great line. That's a great sentence. 2 sentences. Anyway, that's more about the permanence of politics and the permanence of war in the world. And then he has a bit here where he talks about, well, actually, let me jump to the very end, because he continues on this theme for a bit here at the very end of the book. So this is the last section. I am going to read one more section, but this is like the very last part of the book. He says, quote, "State and politics cannot be exterminated. The world will not become depoliticized with the aid of definitions and constructions, all of which circle the polarity of ethics and economics. Economic antagonisms can become political, and the fact that an economic power position could arise proves that the point of the political may be reached from the economic, as well as from any other domain. The often quoted phrase by Walter Rathenau, namely that the destiny today is not politics but economics, originated in this context. It would be more exact to say that politics continues to remain the destiny, but what has occurred is that economics has become political, and thereby the destiny. It is also erroneous to believe that a political position founded on economic superiority is essentially unwarlike, as Joseph Schumpeter says. Essentially unwarlike is the terminology based on the essence of liberal ideology. And imperialism, based on pure economic power, will naturally attempt to sustain a worldwide condition which enables it to apply and manage unmolested its economic means. For example, terminating credit, embargoing raw materials, destroying the currencies of others, and so on. Every attempt of a people to withdraw itself from the effects of such peaceful methods is considered by this imperialism an extra economic power. Pure economic imperialism will also apply a stronger but still economic, and therefore, according to this terminology, non-political, essentially peaceful means of force. A 1921 League of Nations resolution enumerates as examples economic sanctions and severance of the food supply from the civilian population. Finally, it has sufficient technical means to bring about violent death. Modern means of annihilation have been produced by enormous investments of capital and intelligence, surely to be used if necessary. For the application of such means, a new and essentially pacifist vocabulary has been created. War is condemned, but executions, sanctions, punitive expeditions, pacifications, protection of treaties, international police, and measures to assure peace remain. The adversary is thus no longer called an enemy, but a disturber of peace, and is thereby designated to be an outlaw of humanity. A war waged to protect or expand economic power must, with the aid of propaganda, turn into a crusade and into the last war of humanity. This is implicit in the polarity of ethics and economics, a polarity astonishingly systematic and consistent. But this allegedly non-political and apparently even anti-political system serves existing or new emerging friend and enemy groupings and cannot escape the logic of the political. End quote. So he's saying here, he says state and politics cannot be exterminated. If you move into the realm of the economic, if you as has been said, he's got a couple of quotes here where he says that, Walter Rathenau says that destiny today is not politics but economics, and then Joseph Schumpeter says that economic superiority is essentially unwarlike. But he lists various things, denying, a blockade that denies food, refusal to trade with an organization, exploiting resources. There's various means of economic power that could be exerted. And if any entity were to try to exit from the economic system, that would be considered, he says, every attempt of a people to withdraw itself from the effects of such, quote, he's got in quotes here, such peaceful methods, is considered by this imperialism as extra economic power. So you're locked into the economic system, and if you attempt to exit the economic system, then it's you that's initiating force by engaging in extra economic means. And so it's all held in place by the threat of force. Right? He says pure economic imperialism will also apply a stronger, but still economic, essentially peaceful means of force. And he says that it's a new, essentially pacifist vocabulary. So in order to maintain the illusion that we are transcending the realm of the friend-enemy distinction, the realm of the political, we're transcending the realm of war, we just rename things. So it's no longer war, it's an international police action, special operation, or whatever it may be. Nobody really wants to call it a war because we don't want to admit we still live in a world of war. We believe we live in a post-war world, or we're somehow right around the corner there's a post-war world, if only we can just complete these few here, international policing actions. So it's the terminology is changed, and the enemy is no longer called an enemy, but they're now disturbing the international order. They're disturber of the peace. These are violating the international rules-based order. So we don't call them an enemy anymore. And by proclaiming them to be a disturber of the peace, they're now an enemy of humanity, because humanity is on this quest toward global world peace. And so any violation of the admittedly potentially imperialistic and oppressive economic power is violating the rules-based order and violating the global peace, therefore becomes an enemy of humanity. And once someone, as we saw previously, once someone becomes an enemy of humanity, they must be made into monsters. And I talked about this in a previous episode, with going back to the simple sign that you see on people's front lawns that says "Love trumps hate." Well, what you have here is a conflict between love and hate. And with that moral application laid on it, like if you're trying to have a pacifistic world, it becomes sort of hypocrisy to say, well, we're going to engage in war with the non-pacifists in order to bring about the pacifistic world. In order to avoid the sort of hypocrisy, that the enemy must be made subhuman, monstrous, something that cannot be allowed to exist. Right? And so in that previous section that I was reading, let me jump back here for a moment. He says, if the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war and it has become a political motive, then it affirms, even as an extreme possibility, war and even the reason for war. He says war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. The war to end all wars, right? War against war. And in this circumstance, it simultaneously degrades the enemy into moral and other categories, and is forced to make of him a monster, a hateful monster, an evil monster. All of these things are applied, right? The anti-pacifist must be horrific in order to justify bringing the pacifist into war. And so it's forced to make him a monster that must not only be defeated, but also utterly destroyed. In other words, he's an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his borders only. All right, so I think I've made my point on that. And then I'm going to jump back to section 7. I want to read a little bit about the nature of man and how that relates to this topic. He says, quote, "One could test all theories of state and political ideas according to their anthropology, and thereby classify these as to whether they consciously or unconsciously presuppose man to be by nature evil or by nature good. The distinction is to be taken here in a rather summary fashion, and not in any specifically moral or ethical sense. The problematic or unproblematic conception of man is decisive for the presupposition of every further political consideration. The answer to the question whether man is a dangerous being or not, a risky or a harmless creature." And he goes on to say, "I have pointed out several times that the antagonism between the so-called authoritarian and anarchist theories can be traced to these formulas. A part of the theories and postulates which presuppose man to be good is liberal. Without being actually anarchist, they are polemically directed against the intervention of the state. Ingenuous anarchism reveals that the belief in the natural goodness of man is closely tied to the radical denial of state and government. One follows the other, and both foment each other. For the liberals, on the other hand, the goodness of man signifies nothing more than an argument with whose aid the state is made to serve society. This means that society determines its own order, and that state and government are subordinate, and must be distrustingly controlled and bound to precise limits. The classical formulation by Thomas Paine says, "Society is the result of our reasonably regulated needs. Government is the result of our wickedness." The radicalism vis-a-vis state and government grows in proportion to the radical belief in the goodness of man's nature. Bourgeois liberalism was never radical in a political sense, yet it remains self-evident that liberalism's negation of state and the political, its neutralizations, depoliticalizations, and declarations of freedom, have likewise a certain political meaning, and in a concrete situation these are polemically directed against a specific state and its political power. But this is neither a political theory nor a political idea. Although liberalism has not radically denied the state, it has, on the other hand, neither advanced a positive theory of state, nor on its own discovered how to reform the state, but has attempted only to tie the political to the ethical and to subjugate it to economics. It has produced a doctrine of the separation and balance of powers, i.e. a system of checks and controls of state government. This cannot be characterized as either a theory of state or a basic political principle. What remains is the remarkable, and for many certainly disquieting, diagnosis that all genuine political theories presuppose man to be evil, i.e. by no means an unproblematic but a dangerous and dynamic being. This can be easily documented in the works of every specific political thinker. Insofar as they reveal themselves as such, they all agree on the idea of a problematic human nature, no matter how distinct they are in rank and prominent in history." End quote. So I find that section a little strange, actually. He kind of sets the authoritarian and anarchist and says that the anarchist basically believes that people are fundamentally good, and that's why they don't have to be, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, type of thing. The premise of the pure anarchist is that people are good, and it's only the existence of society and the existence of authoritarian people that it's really nonsensical, because who created society, who created the systems that are so oppressive? Must have been people, good people. I guess the premise is that would have to be that the vast majority of people are fundamentally good, non-problematic, and a few bad people seize power and have to be, I don't know, power taken from them somehow. Once you start asking how power is taken from them and kept from them, how they are prevented from seizing power, then you begin to create rules. You begin to create states. You begin to create a system whereby those few psychopathic, power-hungry people that seem to always position themselves into positions of power in the anarchist theory somehow need to be constrained. Either that or just killed outright when you identify them. Maybe that's the anarchist theory. Then the authoritarian being that people are fundamentally evil, although he kind of qualifies his use of the word evil to really mean, well, let's see exactly what he says. He says the distinction is to be taken here in a rather summary fashion and not in any specifically moral or ethical sense. The problematic or unproblematic conception of man is decisive, etc., etc. So really, good and evil might not be the terminology that would best fit what he's trying to say, problematic or unproblematic. And this can be kind of traced, I think, back to the constrained and the unconstrained vision of Thomas Sowell. If, the conservative view being that people have certain qualities, right? We have a general nature to us. We're not utterly shapeable. And some of those qualities include selfishness, include, that we have a desire to exploit one another sometimes, or at least a tendency or possibility of doing that lies in everybody. There are no angels walking among us. Everyone has the potential for screwing other people over, for cheating at things, for taking a little bit more power than we have earned, or finding some way to get one over. And what I find strange about this is that really it seems to me that the American system of checks and balances, which he talks about in here as being liberal, well, maybe it is liberal, but it's, in the sense that it might have derived from the Enlightenment, but it really goes back much further than that. And I think that it's more based on an anti-utopian, right? We have people let interest be set against interest, or whatever that phrase is. Essentially, let people's ambition against ambition. Let people's personal ambitions kind of conflict with one another so that nobody is able to gain too much power. That's based on the idea that people have a problematic nature, and we don't really want any one faction to gain total control because we don't trust them. So there's a certain, I think, he says liberalism is not really, anarchism. It's sort of steps back from that. He says, for the liberals, on the other hand, so he's talking about the anarchists, and then he says, for the liberals, on the other hand, the goodness of man signifies nothing more than an argument with whose aid the state is made to serve society. I would say that so long as you're putting on the people are good, people are evil, that doesn't really differentiate like the liberal. That might differentiate the anarchist from the authoritarian in a sense, but the liberal from the non-liberal, the liberal doesn't fall exactly on either side of that. But the liberal believes that people are shapeable. Not that they're purely good, but that they can be purely good if only we could get rid of all of the bad influences on them, which primarily come from the past, when we were more ignorant than we are now. We're more enlightened now than we were in the past, and so all of the pieces of the past that we still carry around with us are limiting us and causing us to have less than perfect societies. That's really the unconstrained vision, that the purpose of the state then is to shape people into being fundamentally good, as defined by the state, and as defined by whichever faction controls the state, whoever it is that controls the state lays the parameters for what good people are, and then uses the state to make those people fit that form. But that's based on a notion of pliability of people, the unconstrained vision, the blank slate theory. So I think that he's a little bit off. And again, I have to keep saying this was written 90 years ago. And it's hard for me to say what liberalism was and wasn't 90 years ago, other than what I can infer from these books that I read. I can speak much more clearly to what liberalism seems to be today. And I know that at least in the progressivism from back in that era, there was absolutely a sculpting component to it, an expansiveness. It was definitely big government, big business, but they were reaching deeper and deeper into people's lives to shape their behavior, even back then. At any rate, those were the sections that I wanted to read from this book and comment on. There's more in here, but there's not a tremendous amount more in here. I've covered a lot of what I think to be the most important points. Obviously, there are the additional essays and stuff. If you're interested in Carl Schmitt, absolutely pick this up. The concept of the friend-enemy distinction and the liberal attempt to sort of gloss it over and pretend that either it doesn't exist or that we can somehow move past it. I think that is going to come up in a couple of future books, so it's an important thing to keep in mind. And with that, I'm going to close this episode out. Thanks for listening.